Okay, I guess we will get started then. I want to thank everyone for joining us, both our panelists, who I'll be introducing in a minute, and also everyone who's going to be in the audience. I really appreciate your coming on board and listening to us. This is sort of a launch for a series of webinars that we're doing this fall. It is basically the logic of it was initially the 15th anniversary for the Justice for Immigrants campaign, which was launched in 2005. So we wanted an opportunity to kind of present some of the issues that we're dealing with that are of interest to us. We had planned to do something more like a conference, an in-person conference in December of this year. But obviously with everything going on with COVID, we weren't able to do that. So we've kind of shifted our attention to do a series of webinars. This initial webinar is actually linked closely to the Vatican's World Day of Migrants and Refugees. The World Day was just this past Sunday on September 27th. It's the last Sunday of every September. And the focus of the Holy Father for this celebration this year was internally displaced persons. And so this initial webinar is going to be focused on that situation. It's a brief history of the protection of internally displaced persons, kind of a global perspective, and also a church perspective. We hope to use El Salvador as a case study, is the plan. We're to have four panelists. Noah's having a little bit of difficulty getting on. I believe he's actually in now, so never mind, we're all good. Which we have four panelists. The first is Father Robert Stark. He has his PhD in social ethics from the University of Chicago. He's the director of the Office for Social Ministry in the Diocese of Honolulu. And he is the Catholic Church's in the United States liaison for the Migrants and Refugees section at the Vatican. He's going to be talking a little bit about the World Day and kind of the foundations for it in terms of this year's focus. Second is Noah Bullock. He's the executive director of Cristosal, which is an organization that works to advance human rights in Central America through a rights-based research, learning, and programming efforts. He actually came to Cristosal as an intern in 2005 after graduating from the University of Montana in Peace and Conflict Studies and has sort of worked his way up to the executive director position there. So he's got a ton of experience in El Salvador, and he's going to be able to provide a lot of clear insights into what's going on there, some of the underlying political conditions. And then we have Elizabeth Ferris. She's currently at Georgetown University. She's teaching, researching, writing tons. She was a senior fellow and co-director of the Brookings Project on Internal Displacement before Georgetown. She was director of the Church World Services Immigration and Refugee Program. Spent time overseas working on migration issues. Has also written several books on migration and internal displacement. And finally, we have Jana Mason, who's the Senior Advisor for External Relations and Government Affairs at the Washington, D.C. office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. She was formerly the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee and also worked as a policy analyst for the U.S. Committee for Refugees. So it's really a group of real experts on this issue. And so now I want to turn it over to Father Stark, who will begin the presentation. So Father Stark, you're good to go if you're ready. Can we go to the next slide, Tony?
Thank you, Todd. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this Justice for Immigrants 15th Anniversary Webinar Series, and with all of you who are accompanying migrants and refugees in your communities through your organization's work and ministries. I was asked to share how the theme of Pope Francis's World Day of Migrants and Refugees focus on internally displaced persons during this pandemic can possibly help frame this webinar this morning, or today. This year, the Pope's message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees is titled, Like Jesus Christ, Forced to Flee, Welcoming, Protecting, Promoting, and Integrating Internally Displaced Persons. The Pope began the message saying that the tragedy of internally displaced persons is one of the major challenges of our contemporary world. Situations of conflict and humanitarian emergencies aggravated by climate change are increasing the numbers of displaced persons and affecting people already living in a state of dire poverty. A year ago, Pope Francis directed the Migrants and Refugees section in the Vatican to produce some pastoral orientations for the work of the Church with internally displaced persons. The Migrants and Refugees section then conducted a consultation process for over a year with the Catholic organizations and Episcopal conferences around the world who work daily with internally displaced persons. This resulted in a booklet based on best practices with IDPs. Next slide, please. The booklet and the World Day of Migrants and Refugee materials lift up overlooked internally displaced persons, forced to flee, all of whom have a story with a past, a present, that is vital to understand in order for all of us together to build the future we need. The Pope's message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees has also emphasized that internally displaced persons are a forgotten tragedy that has been exacerbated by the global crisis caused by COVID-19. Pope said he wanted this year's World Day of Migrants and Refugees to embrace all those who are experiencing situations of precariousness, abandonment, marginalization, and rejection as a result of the pandemic. Central to the Pope's World Day of Migrants and Refugee message is the scriptural image of the Holy Family. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph forced to flee to Egypt to avoid King Herod's violence. Ironically, in the scriptures, there is very little mention given to the forced flight of the Holy Family, much like there is very little attention today given to internally displaced persons. Please, next slide. Last year, Pope Francis celebrated the World Day of Migrants and Refugees at the end of September by unveiling the first new statue in centuries within St. Peter's Square, a larger-than-life sculpture of a boat filled with refugees from around the world forced to flee down through the ages. And if you look closely, among the fleeing refugees is the Holy Family. These sculptures of displaced persons, located off to the side in St. Peter's Square, were the only figures on the ground present in front of the St. Peter's Basilica in March of this year, when Pope Francis walked across at dusk to a dimly lit square to address the world about the pandemic. And then when he reminded the world that we are all in the same boat and that we can only come out of this storm together. Because of the pandemic this year, Pope Francis celebrated the World Day of Migrants and Refugees in St. Peter's Square in a much more subdued and somber and socially distanced manner. Last Sunday, after the Angelus, Pope Francis spoke about the plight of internally displaced persons forced to flee around the world and pointed out there in St. Peter's Square the migrants and refugees gathered around and near this sculpture of refugees with the Holy Family. Next slide, please. Pope Francis's World Day for Migrants and Refugee message builds on previous year's messages on the four verbs of welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. But this year's message introduced a set of couplet verbs for pastorally accompanying internally displaced persons. The first couplet is to know in order to understand. To understand the phenomena of IDPs, we need to know their story, know more about the reasons for their being displaced. Many are displaced because of violent conflict or environmental disasters, which often exacerbate or are compounded by pervasive poverty. Understanding the root causes of IDPs is essential to pastorally accompanying them. Pope Francis says that when we talk about migrants and displaced persons, internally displaced persons, all too often we stop at statistics. But it's not about statistics. It's about real people. And the Pope emphasizes that if we encounter them, with them, we will get to know not only more about them, but by knowing them and their stories, we will be able to understand not only them, but our world, and be able to build a future that we all need. This is why Pope Francis's message underscores also that we need to be close in order to serve. We need to become close with vulnerable persons including internally displaced persons, in order to pastorally serve with them. Next slide, please. The Pope reminds us that it is vital in our pastoral accompanying IDPs that we listen in order to be reconciled. This is a major lesson from the pandemic, according to the Holy Father. For as he notes, in 2020, silence has reigned for weeks in our streets, a dramatic and troubling silence, but one that has given us the opportunity to listen to the plea of the vulnerable, the displaced, and our seriously ill planet. Another couplet we need is to involve in order to promote. Pope Francis emphasizes that if we really want to promote those whom we assist in our ministries, we must involve them in our ministry, and together be agents in building our future. The pandemic has reminded us that only with the contribution of everyone, especially those groups so often underestimated and overlooked, can we face and overcome this crisis. Next slide, please. The Pope's World Day of Migrants and Refugee message underscores how vital the involvement of the vulnerable is for any solution. Without their participation as protagonists, there will be no solution. Therefore, in order to grow, it is necessary to share. Here, the Pope calls all to learn to share in order to grow together, leaving no one behind. Realizing that we have the same concerns and fears has shown us once more that no one can be saved alone. And for this reason, it is necessary for us to cooperate in order to build the future we all need. Next slide, please. Now, some of the practical and policy details of what this papal message means in pastoral practice are all sketched out in the Pastoral Orientations on Internally Displaced Persons, which was produced by the Migrants and Refugees section through that consultation with persons working in the field all over the world with internally displaced persons. This booklet can be downloaded from the Migrants and Refugees section website and is also available through our the various social media platforms that we try to communicate and share best practices from all around the world. In conclusion, the Pope's message this year for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees provides a framework for pastoral work with internally displaced persons. And the booklet can provide some pastoral orientations based on best practices for accompanying internally displaced persons. Both the message and the pastoral orientations remind us that indeed we need to get to know displaced persons, share in their lives, and become involved with them in order to build together the future that we all need. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Father Stark. I really appreciate it. We'll now turn our attention over to Noah, who will give a little bit of a perspective on the ground. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box below. We'll get to them after these presentations occur. Noah, are you with us? You may need to unmute if you are. I think you were getting on.
No, you may need to press *6 to unmute your phone.
Noah? Okay. Well, then why don't we do this? I know Noah's been trying to get on. He had some issues. So we can go on to the next, we'll do a little bit of reverse order. We can go to Elizabeth Ferris, who can kind of launch into a little bit, Elizabeth and Jana will talk a little bit more broadly about kind of the displaced persons crisis, and then hopefully we'll have Noah who can close it out for us as we move forward. So Tony, I guess you can just go to the next slide, and we can. No, that was back one. No. Move forward one. Sorry about that. And Beth, you are on if you're ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry we're not starting with Noah. I think that the work of Cristosal in terms of raising awareness about what's happening in El Salvador, and particularly some of the recent accomplishments, passing a law on internal displacement that's been in the works for some time would have been a really great place to start. I'd like to really provide more global perspectives on internal displacement, intended to complement what both Noah and Jana are going to say. But first, let me just say how thrilled I was to learn about the theme of this year's World Day of Migrants and Refugees, internal displacement. IDPs have received far too little attention from the international community, and it's fitting that in 2020, after years of working on these issues, to remember that it was really churches, both the Catholic Church through the Caritas Network and where I work, the World Council of Churches, that first put this issue on the international agenda. Colleagues at Caritas and I began hearing from church partners in all regions of the world about internal refugees. And there's no provision in international law for internal refugees, nor for provision of assistance from international agencies. As we'll hear, that's beginning to change as a result of concerted effort by churches and NGOs and civil society and UN agencies and governments. It's a momentum that's been building, and it's certainly needed given the scope of the problem. Next slide, please. So internally displaced people are a large and growing number of people who are forced to leave their communities, but who remain within the borders of their own countries. Sometimes they simply can't escape. As we'll see in a minute, more and more often borders are closing.
Hello?
Sorry.
Noah, if that's you, please mute your computer. Thank you.
Shall I continue?
Yeah, you can continue, Beth.
Okay, the IDPs are often more vulnerable than refugees because they're closer to the violence, and the provision of international assistance is always more difficult for internally displaced people than, say, for refugees. Think about a situation like Syria, where over 6 million Syrians have fled their country, often living in desperate conditions in the host countries of Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, and so on. But for the 8 million or so who are displaced within the borders of their country, oftentimes they're invisible, their international community is not aware of them. We don't hear regular reports like we do from UNHCR on the situation of refugees in a given situation. The data on IDPs is often sketchy. It relies on national authorities to collect data. Sometimes governments aren't interested in, first of all, knowing how many people are internally displaced or publicizing that. And so it's difficult sometimes to get a handle on how many people have been displaced internally. And I'm sure when we hear from Noah, he'll talk about some of the difficulties in finding out how many people are internally displaced in El Salvador. The international definition of IDPs is broader than that of refugees. It's people who are forced to flee their communities because of conflict, human rights violations, disasters, and other issues that certainly have produced a large number of people fleeing their countries. Under international law, it's national authorities that are responsible for refugees. And so you can imagine that sometimes it's the very governments that are part or complicit or actually causing the displacement who are responsible for protecting and assisting those who've been forced to leave their homes. So in places like South Sudan, for example, where the government is very fragile, and certainly elements within the government have contributed to the displacement of millions of people. For people who are displaced within the borders of South Sudan, those authorities are responsible for their well-being. Most of the increase globally in displacement is an internal displacement. You hear a lot about the figure of 80 million displaced people in the world today, the highest number since World War II. But about 44 million of those are IDPs, and while 26 million or so are refugees. And I'm sure Jana will talk more about the figures. But the number of IDPs, their desperate needs, is really all out of whack with the attention that they receive from the international community. Next slide. So this just shows the number of internally displaced persons resulting from conflict, not including those displaced by disasters. And those displaced by disasters vary from year to year. Most displacement from disasters is fairly temporary. You know, there's a flood and people flee and floodwaters go down and they go back home, but not always. I mean, we still have in the United States people who are still displaced from Hurricane Sandy or from the 2018 wildfires in California. There are always some people who can't go back and resume their lives and remain in this sort of limbo sort of displacement. Next slide, please. And now I wanted to mention the relationship between internal and cross-border displacement. From the research we have, and the research evidence on IDPs is certainly much less than for refugees, but from the evidence we have, it seems that most people are displaced several times within the borders of their own country before they try to or are successful in crossing an international border. So in Syria, for example, most Syrian refugees move several times within the country before they cross the border into a neighboring country. The evidence we have from El Salvador is similar, or Guatemala or Honduras. You know, in the case of Central America in particular, you have people fleeing gang violence, and so they'll, you know, move out of their homes and go live with an aunt in another part of the country, and then the gangs track them down, so they move someplace else. And when they can't find safety in their own countries, when their governments are unable to protect them, then they may seek protection in another country. There's also a relationship when refugees are sent back home or back to their home country, but can't return to their communities. This is particularly the case in Afghanistan, where refugees have returned from Pakistan or been deported from Europe back to Kabul, but their hometowns, their communities are still too dangerous. And so they join a growing ranks of internally displaced people inside El Salvador. So there's a relationship between internal displacement and cross-border displacement. Usually there's much more attention to people who cross the border. Almost by definition, you know, refugees are an international issue, an issue of concern to other governments, most obviously the government that's receiving them. But, you know, you can have large numbers of people displaced internally in places like Myanmar or, dare I say, in China, and there's very little information about it, and much more difficult to actually intervene or to provide assistance. Everywhere we see that borders are closing, certainly as a result of COVID-19, most governments in the world have imposed some kind of limitations on international movement, harder to cross borders. The U.S. has, by and large, closed its borders to both Canada and Mexico. Most governments who have laws on refugee protection make some provision to allow those who are fleeing for their lives and asking for safety to bypass some of those restrictions, to enable them to enter the asylum process, even if they're quarantined during the period of their initial arrival. The U.S. government hasn't done that as yet. This photo is of the U.S.-Mexico border crossing. You can see how empty it looks compared with a normal time. Another big trend is that this is in the case of refugees. We see internal displacement becoming protracted, not just being a temporary phenomenon where people leave until things cool down, but where internal displacement can drag on for months or years, or in worst cases, even decades. There are people who are internally displaced in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Somalia who have been displaced for more than 10 or 15 years. And that the drive for solutions, how can people go back home or settle down or be integrated into their new communities is certainly challenging for IDPs themselves as well as those working with them. Next slide, please. So the international response to IDPs has always been complicated because of this pesky issue of national sovereignty. What happens within a border is largely the concern of that country. It's much more difficult for a UN agency, for example, to intervene and to provide assistance inside Syria than to help people in neighboring countries. While refugees can count on a UN convention, a very strong UN agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, IDPs face a different reality. There is no convention. There are generally accepted guiding principles, but those are not binding international law. There's a very broad definition of IDPs, which is not a legal definition, unlike the definition of refugees. And there is no single UN agency charged with protecting and assisting IDPs, although, as we'll hear from Jana, a number of agencies, including UNHCR, have stepped up to try to fill that void. In many ways, I think the issue of internal displacement is a human rights success story. You know, back in 1990, when this issue was first surfacing, nobody had ever heard of an IDP, and now you've got tons of reports and agencies who are working on IDP programs and more funding for IDPs. But still, in comparison with other people on the move, IDPs haven't received the attention that I think they deserve. In January this year, the UN Secretary General set up a new high-level panel on internal displacement, in part to respond to criticism that the new global compacts on refugees and migrants really ignored the issue of IDPs. So this is a group of very senior, well-known people who are grappling with the issue of how to get more attention to IDPs, and most of all, how to find solutions so that displacement doesn't become so protracted and that people are enabled to get on with their lives and get out of that terrible limbo. Next slide, please. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to hearing from Noah and Jana and responding to any questions.
Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate it. I think we do have Noah on at this point. Noah, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. I apologize for any confusion on our end for this, but I'm really glad that we were able to connect you with the audio. I think now we can probably why don't we just step back? So Father Stark had given a brief talk, and then Beth kind of gave a big overview. Now we can step back a little bit and sort of explore a little bit more what's going on in El Salvador from your perspective down there and the time that you've been there, and particularly now. And then once we're finished with yours, we'll move back on to Jenna, and she can close out for us before we go into the Q&A. So why don't you go ahead, Noah, and really appreciate looking forward to hearing you.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for the trouble connecting by the phone, but I'm really glad to be with you, glad to be with Beth, who's a good friend, and good to meet you, Janet, and Father Stark. I think just to lead off of what Beth was presenting in Central America, one of the challenges with trying to generate responsibility for responding and protecting internally displaced people, it has been kind of what I would call a Cain and Abel problem. That line where God saying where is his brother, and he says, "In my brother's keeper." And so when we look at human rights in general in the world, the recognition of inherent human dignity and rights raises a corollary responsibility to protect them. And who are those people who protect people? Well, in the modern world, it's the nation state. What gets complicated is when people move beyond national borders. When people start to move around, governments start asking, am I my brother's keeper? As to say, am I responsible for these people? In the case of migrants, they are some of the most difficult groups of people to generate responsibility of states to protect. Refugees, as Dr. Ferris mentioned, have a specific convention. Even that has implied the need for great advocacy and struggle to protect the rights. And IDPs are understood to be the responsibility of the state of origin because of national sovereignty and citizenship. To say that they haven't crossed an international border, and so their rights and dignity, for their protection, is the responsibility of the states of origin. But in Central America, the existence of internal displacement has been very uncomfortable for national governments because in Central America, one of the leading kind of political issues is the issue of security and governance or government and political leaders in the country, their own election viability is usually on the basis of them being able to demonstrate some sort of control over the territory. And so the existence of people, groups of people, even large numbers of people fleeing their homes is contrary to the political narrative that in some way or other the national governments are indeed controlling the territories and are able to protect their people. So that is what I mean by the Cain and Abel brothers keeper problem for internally displaced people. The national government tend to deny the existence of it, and so that is still the baseline for advocacy is generating recognition, and from recognition trying to hold governments account to making response a priority. And that has meant breaking down some sort of dogma about security issues itself. The security in terms of response from states is really largely a repressive activity. That's sort of you can see it in the photos in the top left corner. The state's response to security has been largely militarized and repressive. And what displacement, in function of trying to get homicides down in terms of trying to combat organized criminal groups operating in the area. But on what internal displacement challenges government to do is understand the broader impact of security or insecurity in the society. And so that's what we have been trying to highlight. When people are internally displaced in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, they generally do not feel like they're able to avail themselves of the protection of the state, which is one of the language, that's the language from the Refugee Convention, because one, the states may not have capability of doing that. There are no specific programs in the countries to address IDPs, and two, because of trust. The very militarization that you see in that image in the top corner has led the state security response to be abusive, to even generate internal displacement itself. There's a sense in the population that government institutions are even corrupt. And so IDPs, their first challenge is recognizing that their protection is their own responsibility in the absence of a commitment by the government in the country. And so they usually activate their own social or family networks to try and find their first sort of protection options displacing internally in the country. And the presence of organized crime and criminal groups across the country makes that a very challenging proposition. Families internally displacing in El Salvador have to go into generally kind of a state of hiding, what we call confinement, meaning that their protection is no longer being able to exercise their general freedom, their fundamental freedoms like moving about, getting jobs. And so that is the big limitation in terms of internal displacement as a viable protection response to families fleeing violence in Central America. Is that the presence of organized crime makes it so that they aren't necessarily able to reintegrate in sites of internal displacement. And in fact, the division of the country into certain territories associated with criminal groups generates great distrust among Salvadoran communities about people coming from the outside. We've worked hard to try and help internally displaced people reintegrate into communities, and one of the greatest barriers is the sense that in communities without high levels of insecurity, where there are security conditions for reintegration, those communities have often kept themselves safe by keeping outsiders out, and even by forming vigilante death squad groups that have worked to keep out the presence of gangs in the country. And so not only is there the lack of sort of a capability and trust with state institutions to receive assistance in relocation or in internal displacement, but the communities themselves that would be host communities are often skeptical of people coming from the outside. And then sort of the third challenge for internal displaced people is usually that they are displacing in family groups. As a distinction with the internal displacement situations in more traditional armed conflict settings, Central Americans tend to displace in what we call drip drops. And among thousands of different drips, we get large pools of people, right? And so the family units displaced, and in those family units, there are usually young males. And young males who are displacing outside of their own territory attract the attention of state security responses because of the criminalization of poor young men, and also attract the attention of criminal organizations as they move across the country to control different territories, because young men will be associated with potentially other gangs, rival gangs. So internal displacement is a big challenge in terms of producing sustainable protection outcomes for people. This situation in the context of the pandemic has been even more acute. Internally displaced people, different from migrants and even refugees sometimes, don't necessarily have a good plan. They don't have a destination necessarily, and they lose generally their livelihood. They lose to some degree their social networks, and so when the pandemic hit, these are people who are already really in the red, people who don't have the same resources to be resilient as the economy shut down, and in El Salvador, we faced one of the longest lockdowns, military-imposed lockdowns in the world. And so the internally displaced people that we've been working with in El Salvador were some of the first groups of people that entered into a real food crisis. Their incipient new economic activities, their unsecure sort of housing scenarios all became at risk in the context of the lockdowns. And that highlighted for us how far the Salvadoran government still needs to come in order to be able to have effective response and support internally displaced people in obtaining durable solutions and safeguarding their lives. I'm going to say a little bit about the state responses now. I mentioned the limitation that the state responses have been largely focused on repressive militarized responses. In short, you hear even in the Bukele administration, the current presidential administration of El Salvador, the narrative that, no, don't worry about displacement, we're going to win the war. And when we win the war, then there will be no more internally displaced people. But the reality is that in moments of intensified sort of warlike strategy, we have had increased internal displacement. And this is a war that's been going on now for 2 decades without a military victory really in sight. So that's been the priority. We have, as an organization, worked with thousands of internally displaced people now. And one of our initial strategies was to try and force the state to recognize and build a response using strategic litigation. So we, working alongside 6 different families who are being internally displaced by violence, presented in 2016, 17, to the Supreme Court cases against the Salvadoran government for failing to protect internally displaced people. And the outcome of those Supreme Court rulings were very optimistic. The Supreme Court recognized internal displacement and said that the failure to recognize displacement and protect internally displaced people constituted a systematic violation of constitutional rights of all Salvadorans, especially Salvadorans internally displaced, and put certain obligations on the legislature, on the executive, to bring the normative structure in the country in line with international standards on internal displacement, and to prioritize response. In that context, Crystal Sal, our organization, drafted a proposed legislation special legislation to establish a victims protection system that would be able to help coordinate an effective response to families fleeing violence. With Elizabeth's help, she came down and helped us do advocacy the law was passed last year and ratified, one of the first actions of the new president. But that process has stalled a bit. It stalled in that what would follow the approval of the law is the establishment of a national policy and regulatory framework for its implementation. Those things haven't happened. And then the first national budget of this president's administration, the institutional lead, the National Directorate for Assistance of Victims, which established in the new law, their budget was cut down to about $225,000. And at the same time, the military budget was increased by $600 million. So we can't yet say that we have substantive political commitment to prioritize response and protection of internally displaced people. It's important to mention that data has been a challenge, gathering information about how many people are internally displaced in El Salvador annually, and that's a product of the failure of recognition. State institutions don't document or register internal displacement generally, and so we don't have much official data. There have been efforts with support from the UNHCR to do characterizations, national characterizations, to try and improve the data gap. But mostly since 2012, the primary data point that we have in El Salvador about internal displacement has come from a national survey conducted by the Jesuit University in San Salvador, the UCA. And last year, we helped with the International Displacement Monitoring Center, helped to improve that methodology and once in how they formulate the question about internal displacement. And the result is an increase, a significant increase in the number of people in El Salvador who answered the question positively that they had been forced to flee their place of residency as a consequence of violence and insecurity. And so last year there was an estimated about 400 to 500,000 internally displaced people in El Salvador, which is surprising because homicide rates in June, throughout the whole year, but specifically in June, began to drop. And one of the things that's important about internal displacement in Central America is it reveals that security is not limited to homicide reduction. Homicide reduction is often a reflection of decisions made by criminal organizations that operate in the territory through truces or political strategies to increase or decrease homicide. But their continued control over territories is what generates displacement. When people believe that criminal organizations have the capacity to persecute and carry out threats and that the state is unable to protect them, then they internally displace. It's also important to note that that number, that large number, almost 500,000 internally displaced people, isn't the same thing as understanding need. Not necessarily all 400 or 500,000 people who were forced to change their residency because of insecurity and violence necessarily had the same levels of need. A middle-class family that ended their rent in one area and moved and rented to another one without losing the jobs, generally don't have the same need as a poor family that's uprooted, loses their livelihood, and has had to find a way to survive. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. We don't necessarily know what the magnitude of need is all the time. The other important thing to note about internal displacement is the connection with cross-border movements. I mentioned the difficulty for internally displaced people in finding durable solutions in El Salvador through internal displacement, and that generally unaddressed humanitarian need, unaddressed security need, sooner or later produce the need to leave the country. And once people cross an international border, the Cain and Abel question of am I my brother's keeper falls onto the governments, the countries that are of transit or hosting of these people, and they enter into a cycle of immigration or failed immigration, failed ability to access international protection, which creates something that's very new in some ways in Central America, where we have now a group, probably hundreds of thousands of people who feel that they cannot stay in their countries of origin, have made multiple attempts at immigration or even applying for asylum. In Guatemala, for example, we found during the pandemic people who in a question of 6 months have made 4 attempts to immigrate and apply for asylum in the United States. And so what we have are hundreds of thousands of people moving across the Mesoamerican immigration corridor whose dignity and rights, whose very lives are not being assumed as a responsibility by any state. It constitutes a massive failure of the international human rights system or the international community to respond to a crisis of human mobility in the Mesoamerican corridor. So I'll leave it at that. There's tons of things to talk about, and I look forward to the questions and hearing Janet's presentation. Thank you very much for including me in this really important series.
Thank you very much, Noah. Really appreciate your insights. I think a lot of perspectives that, and insights that people don't necessarily know about, here in the United States. So it's always very helpful. Jana, if we can now turn to you, I'll have Tony move the slides up to your presentation, and you can go right ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for asking UNHCR to participate. And I just want to start by saying how much we appreciated the message from Pope Francis a few days ago that was released on the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, and particularly the fact that that message focused on the plight of IDPs, which has, as we've discussed already, are often overlooked when we talk about refugee and migration issues. We issued our own press statement welcoming the statement by Pope Francis and echoing his call to empower displaced people. So we very much appreciate that. If you want to go to the first slide, where I have a couple of graphs. If you look on the top real quickly, just to back up and put it in the global context that Beth was mentioning, as she mentioned, we are currently witnessing the largest level of forced displacement in basically recorded history. We say since World War II, but really the highest figure on record. And that's because the old crises don't go away. Think Afghanistan, Somalia, now Syria, and the new crises, in which, Central America might be one of the newer ones, and there are certainly many around the world. The new ones start, the old ones don't go away. That's how we get to 80 million. Now, for most of our history, going back to 1950, refugees have been the largest number of these forced displaced, at least for the early years, early decades. Where we are now, if you look at this first graph, of the 3 main categories, refugees being people who have crossed an international border, and for our purposes, UNHCR, we're talking about conflict-affected people, not necessarily natural disasters, although, these people obviously are displaced and have similar needs, but people fleeing war, conflict, people who are fleeing persecution. They cross the border, they become refugees. That's about 30 million right now. Asylum seekers, a smaller number, about 4 million, people who have lodged individual claims for refugee status, either with a government or in some cases with my agency, and they're waiting for their claim to be heard. And then finally, IDPs. Now, in recent decades, that percentage has flipped, and IDPs are now about 44 million, so over half of global forced displacement is due to internal displacement. Now, this change over the years has had some major implications for how we do our work. One of them, as Beth mentioned, unlike with refugees, there's no international convention, no treaty on how governments are supposed to respond to refugees, and there's no lead agency. My agency is the lead agency globally for refugees, and of course, everything we do with partners, including CRS, Caritas agencies around the world, USCCB, but there is no lead agency for IDPs. That doesn't mean that we don't help them. The UN agencies collectively with our NGO partners basically do almost all the same things for IDPs that we do for refugees, but there are some major challenges involved in that. The first one Beth mentioned is sovereignty. We only work with the knowledge and permission of governments, whether it's helping IDPs or whether it's helping refugees. And I would think most NGOs do the same. So sovereignty is an issue, but it's not the only challenge. One of the biggest challenges is that in the case of IDPs, particularly conflict-affected IDPs, the government is often the problem. They're often the ones persecuting their own people, a segment of the population, or being unable or unwilling to protect civilians from persecution by non-state actors, gangs, which we see in the case of El Salvador and elsewhere in Central America. So governments don't often want the international community in their country seeing what's happening. In the case of natural disasters, that's less political. They usually welcome assistance. But when it's conflict-affected displacement, particularly if they're the bad guys, they're often very hesitant to let the international community in to see what they're doing. So we work with a lot of restrictions. The other main challenge is that when we're unlike with refugee situations, where we're working usually in safe countries where refugees are safe, say, for example, Jordan or Turkey for Syrians. With IDPs, we're often working in war zones where it's incredibly dangerous for our staff and for the populations that we serve. Very dangerous, often on the front lines. You also have a lot of issues of aid diversion. The U.S. government and other donors understandably are very concerned in a situation like inside Syria, inside Yemen. Is there diversion of the aid that the international community is bringing in? It doesn't prevent us from doing that, but we have to work within a system of sanctions and with a lot of scrutiny about what we're doing. So then if you look at the bottom of the graph, real quickly, just to show where the IDPs are, they're in just about every continent except maybe Antarctica, although maybe Beth will correct me. There's probably some disaster-related displacement there. But in terms of conflict displacement, the largest region, understandably, is Africa. The Democratic Republic of the Congo alone has over 5 million IDPs. And then if you look at Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan, Ethiopia, South Sudan, all of those have between 1 and 3 million. Other countries have smaller numbers. Cameroon, Mali, Central African Republic, Niger, Mozambique, all over Africa there is internal displacement, and often countries are trading refugees across each other's borders, and they have IDPs, and often it's a result of regional conflicts like in the Lake Chad Basin, where conflict is engulfing several countries at once. The second largest region, if you look at by the bar graph, it would be MENA, Middle East and North Africa. That's largely Syria, which to this day continues to be the largest producer of refugees or IDPs, over 6.2 million IDPs in Syria. You also have Yemen, Iraq, smaller numbers in Libya and elsewhere. Then if you look closer to home, to the Americas, Colombia, which isn't as much in the news as it used to be, and a lot of people think, okay, there was a peace deal with the FARC, maybe that's resolved. Well, for various reasons, Colombia still leads the global number of IDPs with almost 8 million. And in the Central America region, which we're talking about, Honduras alone has about 250,000 IDPs, and El Salvador, which we've been talking about, based on our numbers, it's about 72,000. You will see differences in IDP estimates because sometimes it depends on whether you're talking government figures or somebody else's figures, or you're talking official registration versus maybe informal numbers, but probably about 72,000 is the number we've seen for El Salvador. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region, won't surprise anyone, Afghanistan, in addition to all the Afghan refugees still living in Pakistan and Iran, you have about 2.5 million Afghan IDPs. Burma, the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities in Burma. The Philippines, you've got about 180,000 conflict IDPs, mostly in the southern Philippines, in addition to disaster-induced displacement. And even Pakistan, which is still hosting about 1.5 million Afghan refugees, has over 100,000 conflict IDPs of their own. So then, I guess if rounding that out would be Europe, and you tend to think Europe, IDPs, well, we have Ukraine still going on, probably about 750,000 IDPs. We have Azerbaijan, Georgia, Even still, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, for various reasons, that hasn't been resolved yet. If you go to the next slide, we can go over this one really quickly. The next slide just shows that 42% of all IDPs are in only 3 countries. If you add Colombia, Syria, and the DRC, you know, if you could solve these 3 situations, you would cut the number of IDPs, you know, close to half, right, over 40%. The problem is, look at the situations we're talking about: Colombia, Syria, DRC, tough nuts to crack, situations that have been going on for years without any resolution. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to very quickly just explain that UNHCR is really stepping up our engagement to try to resolve IDP situations, and we have focused on 9 target operations in all the regions that I just mentioned to focus on improving our protection, our assistance, and solutions. And the next slide is just to show that our focus is both on keeping protection central and, like I said, finding solutions. By protection, I mean not only making sure that IDPs aren't forced back to their home areas if it's still dangerous, but that they don't enter into a lot of negative behaviors like child marriage, forced labor. They're often subject to forced recruitment. IDPs are often very subject to sexual and gender-based violence, and we try to provide protection from all of those. At the same time, we're providing documentation, food assistance, education, livelihoods, everything else that IDPs need. Real quickly, the last 2 slides, I just want to mention, since we're talking about the Americas region, Colombia, again, if you look at, you know, why haven't IDPs gone home, not only is it that some of the armed groups aren't participants in the peace deal, the FARC is, but there are a lot of other armed combatants, but you have issues of compensation, land and property restitution, implementation of certain points in the peace deal that just hasn't happened. So we saw 139,000 new conflict-related displacements just last year alone. And now Venezuela is also hosting the largest number of Venezuelan refugees in the region. They're hosting about 1.6 million Venezuelans in addition to their own 8 million IDPs. And on the last slide, just to bring it back to what we're talking about, Central America, you know, if this region of the world were anywhere else in the world, I think you'd see more of a typical response that would include a lot of IDP assistance. I think because it's in the U.S. backyard and it gets caught up in some of the political issues we were talking about, it's a bit of a tricky situation. But we are working to try to improve the asylum systems of the host countries, including Mexico and Costa Rica, because many Central American refugees would stay in those countries if they found protection and they found assistance. But ideally, the best solution will be more investment, more development in the source countries themselves, in Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala, to try to make the conditions be so that people do not feel they need to leave their home countries and seek safety elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jana. There is a ton of information that obviously we have to get through and sort of process. I know we're at the top of the hour or close to it. I'm hoping we can stay a couple minutes over so that we can answer some questions. I guess one of the first questions, sort of broadly speaking, is the United States continuing to deport El Salvadorians to El Salvador? And how is that response? What is the response to that on the ground? Is it how are they welcomed or not welcomed? This is sort of open to, I think, all three of you. If you have any insights, if you could try to keep it brief, that would be appreciated. But how's that going? What's happening there?
Todd, we have been doing monitoring of deportation during the pandemic, and the most recent, or the numbers in our last report, were around 65,000 people had been returned to the three countries of the Northern Triangle during the pandemic. The documentation and monitoring of the reintegration that we've been doing has showed differences in the three countries, but there's a large stigma attached to people who are being deported during the pandemic because of the sense that there aren't appropriate public health measures being taken in detention centers in the United States and in the decision to deport people and the conditions on the planes themselves. Also, people are being deported in large numbers from Mexico, who are being, these are people who are what we call expelled from the U.S., generally have been sent back to Mexico, and then from Mexico returned back to country of origin. So these are very adverse conditions for people who return to their countries of origin during lockdowns. Even, for example, in Honduras, there's still curfews, which people are restricted from leaving their house on the basis of like the number of their documents, identity documents. So it's still ongoing. It's a very difficult. It puts a big burden on the countries trying to manage the public health response because they have to create quarantine centers and responses for people coming back into the country. But there's tons to talk about on this issue, but in general, that's what's happening.
Thanks so much. Does anyone else have anything to add to that, what Noah said?
Yeah, I'll just mention a court decision from last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, which upheld Trump's decision to rescind temporary protected status for nationalities of a number of countries, including El Salvador. You know, I think it affects about 400,000 people. I'm sure there will be other court cases on this, but I mean, the possibility for even larger scale deportations in the future is certainly a real one.
Great. Jenna, I don't know if you had anything, or Father Stark, are you all good?
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, then let me move on to another question then. This one is for Beth. And so you mentioned the refugees who are being Father Stark, did you?
Oh, fine.
No?
No, it's all fine. Keep going.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. So Beth, you mentioned that there are refugees that are being returned, and after being returned, from what I understand, they become internally displaced persons. Are they refugees in process, or are they already recognized as refugees when they're returned? If they're already recognized as refugees, where and why are they being returned in the first place?
Yeah, there are a couple of different situations. Some is that refugees in Pakistan and Iran, for example, have decided voluntarily to return, although in some cases it isn't so voluntary when assistance is cut off and other measures are taken. So some people have been recognized as refugees and signed something that says that they are voluntarily returning to the country, but then they can't get back to their communities, so they in effect become IDPs. The other case are individuals, Afghans, who have gone through the asylum process in Europe and have been found not to be refugees, and therefore they've been returned as rejected asylum seekers. They haven't been recognized as refugees, but many of them leaving for the same kinds of reasons as those who are recognized as refugees. So, you know, people are being returned to Afghanistan, but for the most part, it's within the parameters of international refugee law.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm giving you two more quick questions. The first one, this one I guess is for Noah, but it could also be for anyone who's has some insights into it. I know traditionally there's sort of one of the roles for displacement is U.S. intervention in the region, Central America. This goes back historically, perhaps the Soviet Union as well, during the Cold War and the conflicts that occurred there. Is there any fear within these countries of further U.S. interventions that might increase displacement moving forward? And are they reactive in a way to try and ensure that that doesn't happen? Any thoughts on that issue about U.S. intervention in particular?
Yeah, it's a very complicated history and question. We should remember that the United States' role in recent history in Central America has not been one that's necessarily generated fear of governments during the Cold War, fear among governments. During the Cold War, the United States made significant trade-offs to try and ally themselves with governments that were committing some of the worst human rights violations of the past century under the guise of a geopolitical strategy that contained communism. So the United States was an ally of governments of Central America during that period in a global strategy to counter the spread of communism. Crystal Sal, for example, is the legal representative of the victims of the El Mozote massacre, which is the largest massacre perpetrated on the American continent in modern times. About 1,000 people, the majority of them children, were slaughtered by the Salvadoran armed forces. That case is actually a big, hot political issue in the last 2 weeks here. But the ongoing relationship with the United States to the region has been one in which there was a significant change from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. The Obama administration, with many of, they've been criticized for some of their immigration strategy, but the strategy towards countries in the region, they tried to put a holistic approach in strengthening rule of law, strengthening human rights protections, and sort of a prosperity economic development agenda. That program was cut by the Trump administration, who was focused very much on creating these ACA agreements. I forget what ACA stands for in English. Maybe someone can correct me there. But it's basically that the strategy currently of the United States government has again to be on to make trade-offs as long as Central American governments are supporting us in our immigration strategy, which is largely deterrent, not necessarily management or with a protection or human rights approach, then we will look the other way. For example, in the case of Honduras, the president, Juan Orlando, is, he's been indicted by the court in New York as a co-conspirator of narco trafficking and international crime. You have the United States sort of backed off on a key role in Guatemala, supporting efforts to counter impunity through an international commission, and that commission then was closed down by reactionary forces in the country. And to be honest, we in El Salvador have a difficult situation with our new president, who has, especially during the pandemic, seen himself as above the law. He's done actions to restrict rights that have been unconstitutional. He has not respected court orders, and he has been very hostile to journalists and human rights organizations. Just last Thursday, he called out Crystal Sal among 2 other human rights organizations in the region and independent journalists, basically calling us enemies of the state and creating a very hostile environment for us to do our work. So this is when I say there's a trade-off. The trade-off is that the Bukele administration, at least politically, says that they're supportive of the immigration strategy of the United States, and there's a strong relationship between him and the U.S. ambassador, to the detriment, I would say, of rule of law, democratic, constitutional order, and really the well-being of anyone who the president considers to be political opposition or human rights organizations and journalists.
Thanks so much. One quick last question, and I know we are over time, but I think we could go on for another 45 minutes. And this is, I guess, for each of you. I'm taking the moderator's prerogative to ask this. A lot of the people I think that are listening today, are on the ground. They work with, migrants directly. They're in advocacy. They're mainly U.S. based, I imagine. And if you each have one suggestion, if you choose to answer, one suggestion that they might be able to do in order, from their perspective, to help sort of address this problem, which seems so huge, which is huge. Do you have like a single suggestion, whether it's religious in nature or policy-wise or otherwise, that you might suggest? Maybe we can start with Father Stark, if you're still with us, Father Stark, and then just move in order from the presentation or something like that. What can people do?
Sure. Thank you, Todd. I'd be really interested. I've learned a lot. Again, I'd be interested in the response to this from the other panelists, but especially from the people that have been listening and calling in. I would just, again, lift up one of the main parts of Pope Francis' message in the World Day of Migrants and Refugees with regards to internally displaced persons, and that is this idea that the importance of getting close to and learning from the stories of migrants and refugees, because many migrants and refugees, as the presentation pointed out, have at one point or another been internally displaced persons in their own countries, and many have members of their family that have actually become that as well. So they're connected to internally displaced persons back in their country. I know that's the case with regards to El Salvador and Honduras for many of the El Salvadorian and Honduran families here. But Mexico has a significant number of persons that could, if they were recognized, be considered internally displaced persons as well, particularly from the rural to the urban area. And I think that Pope Francis, what he's trying to say continually and saying it is the importance of getting close and learning from the migrants and refugees in our community. And they can tell us a lot about, in their story, in their past and in their present story, what are the conditions for internally displaced persons. And that's a way in which, in sharing that story in our own communities, is a way to lift up the reality of internally displaced persons. It doesn't make it so distant, because many of the people they're living with in our communities have been internally displaced persons. And it's important to involve them in the way that we actually, as our communities, relate to this issue and create sister communities, et cetera, back in. I know that there's, in Texas, there's several communities that are sister communities and parishes with parishes in Honduras and in Guatemala that are now dealing heavily with this question of IDP, with internally displaced persons.
Thank you so much, Father Stark. Really appreciate that. Beth, do you have a quick, brief sort of thing that people could do to sort of push along a sort of a positive vision?
Yeah, I was going to actually say something similar to Father Stark, and that is to recognize that people that you're dealing with in the United States or in their country of asylum, may have been through long journeys, not just a difficult journey to reach the U.S. border through Mexico and so on, but also within their country. And just to be aware of the trauma it causes, and also to know that they usually have relatives back home who are living in insecurity. I think that level of pastoral care or psychosocial support is really more important than ever.
Great, thank you, Beth. Noah, we'll go to you next since you were third. Do you have any like a simple suggestion that people can do?
I think that people in the United States we need to have conversations to try and reframe what refugee protection and humanitarian response in conflict scenarios means. It's often seen, I think, from a political and budgetary standpoint as a burden, but we need to see it as a strategic action. Humanitarian protection of people fleeing violence is the first step in stabilizing certain populations and even the countries, and it creates the conditions for peace building. And peace building is the way in which we can end conflict and therefore end protracted and new displacement events. So I think that we need to reclaim that narrative that the U.S.'s role in promoting humanitarian response is not something that's like an added extra. It's a key piece for international peace and security, and we need to see our own security as linked to that. In the Central American context, I think that what we need to do is put the focus at the local level, building in community solidarity and resources to help reintegrate internally displaced people and build capacity of the state to respond to citizens' needs.
Thank you, Noah. Super helpful. And Jana, last but not least, do you have any suggestion or something that people could engage in to help push this support for internally displaced persons?
Well, I think part of it is being done through these type of webinars where hopefully, good information can be passed along. I think here in the U.S., policymakers need to know that there is a constituency out there who cares about forcibly displaced people, both in the U.S. and overseas. There's so much misinformation about refugees, migrants, IDPs, the anti-immigrant type of agencies who want to paint them all as either terrorist threats or abusers of the immigration system or people just trying to get welfare. I mean, those forces are very loud, and sometimes the forces of goodness who care about displaced people aren't as loud. So I think just letting policymakers know that we expect the U.S. to continue to be a leader both overseas and at home in protecting victims of persecution is very important.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to all of our participants who had an opportunity to give us a perspective from their own work. I'm sorry for keeping you all overtime a little bit, but I didn't want to cut it short, and I wanted to get some migrants air community during COVID-19. An English version will be at 2, and then we will do it in Spanish as well at 3. Until next week, I hope you all do well, and thanks again for joining us. And we'll see you next Wednesday, I hope. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one, y'all. Sure. No problem.